Noam Chomsky, who might be the most important linguist in the world and one of the most influential intellectuals over the last decades, welcomes teleSUR in his small office at Tucson University, where he just moved in. His reflections are heard carefully by the international political community. Today, he speaks about humanitarian interventions, the challenges we must face as a globalized society, and the role of the new U.S. American President, Donald Trump.
From the point of view of U.S. power, he's harming it. But from the point of view of U.S. elites, he's giving them everything they want. I mean, in fact, what's going on in the United States, if you think about it, is kind of a two-level wrecking ball, if you want to call it that. Trump, his role, whether this is conscious or not, I don't know, but you can see what's happening. Trump's role is to ensure that the media and public attention are always concentrated on him. So every time you turn on a television set, it's Trump. Open the front page of the newspaper, Trump. And in order to maintain, he's a con man, basically, a showman. And in order to maintain public attention, you have to do something crazy. Otherwise, nobody's going to pay attention to you. If you do normal things, you'll be, way back somewhere. So every day there's one insane thing after another. And then, the media, he makes some crazy lie. He had the biggest crowd in history or something. The media looks at it and says, no, it wasn't the biggest crowd. But meanwhile, he's on to something else, and then you go to that one. And while this show is going on in public, in the background, the wrecking crew is working. Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, the guys in the cabinet who write his executive orders. What they're doing is systematically dismantling every aspect of government that works for the benefit of the population. This goes from workers' rights to pollution of the environment, rules for protecting consumers. I mean, anything you can think of is being dismantled. And all efforts are being devoted, kind of almost with fanaticism, to enrich and empower their actual constituency, which is super wealth and corporate power, who are delighted. That's why the stock market goes up. Stock market has not much to do with the economy, but keeps booming because that's the rich people, and they love being granted. Now, the worst policies that he's carrying out, the most dangerous, are barely discussed. Those are the two existential threats that we face. You have to face the fact that humans are now in a situation which has never arisen in human history. This generation has to decide whether organized human existence is going to continue. And it's not a joke. It's global warming and nuclear war. Those are the major issues. They ought to be big headlines every day. And Trump's actions are making both of them much more dangerous. In the case of nuclear war, the policies are significantly increasing the threat of nuclear war. In the case of global warming, it's almost indescribable. Not only has the U.S. pulled out uniquely, alone in the world, it's pulled out from the international efforts to do at least something about it. But beyond that, the Trump administration is going out of its way to increase the threat. Listen to his State of the Union address. The only phrase about global climate was to talk about our beautiful, clean coal, the worst polluter there is, which we have 1,000 years of it, And look at the new budgets that's coming out. Sharply cuts research and support for any kind of renewable energy, more subsidies and support for the most polluting, destructive things. And it's not just Trump, it's the entire Republican leadership. So if you look at the 2016 election, at the primaries, every single candidate, not a single exception, either denied that global warming is taking place or said maybe it is, but we shouldn't do anything about it, which I think is worse. They were called the moderates, like Kasich. So then, and if you look at Trump himself, or say Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, they know perfectly well that humans are causing global warming. In fact, Trump has golf courses all over. He hasn't built a wall in Mexico yet, but he's building walls around his golf courses to make sure that the sea level doesn't destroy them. Rex Tillerson was CEO of ExxonMobil since the 1970s. Scientists at ExxonMobil have been, we now know they've been made public, forced to be made public. They've been producing severe warnings to the leadership about the effect of the use of petroleum on destroying the environment. So they all know about it, but they're not doing anything about it, which is a level of criminality that is almost hard to find words to describe. I mean, here are, educated, well-off, rich people, upper elite, who know that what they're doing is destroying the prospects for organized human life, and do it anyway because they make more profit tomorrow. Can you think of an analog to that in human history? I really can't. I mean, I've said sometimes what's considered an utterly outrageous comment that today's Republican Party is the most dangerous organization in human history. Sounds outrageous, but think about it for a moment. I mean, Hitler didn't intend to destroy the prospects for human existence. Attila the Hun didn't intend that. Nobody has. But that's what these guys intend. And it's not ignorant, uneducated, religious fundamentalists, whatever you want to blame people. These are the most educated, best supported people in the world. And they're doing this eyes open because you can make more profit tomorrow. It's hard to imagine anything like it. And it's not just my opinion. Take, say, the Bulletin of the Atomic Science, the Doomsday Clock, famous Doomsday Clock. It's set up by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists since 1947. Each year they gather distinguished physicists, political analysts, others to look at the state of the world and make a judgment of how far we are from terminal disaster. Midnight is terminal disaster. In 1947, the clock was set 7 minutes to midnight after the atom bomb. Moved up and back since. Now it's at the closest it's been to midnight ever. They just moved it to 2 minutes to midnight. That's where it was in 1953, when the U.S. and later the USSR exploded thermonuclear weapons, which could totally destroy the world. So it went to 2 minutes. Now it's back to 2 minutes. And that's the Republican Party. That's the ones who are running the country and dominating the world. There's never been a situation like this. It does not have the economic power that it once did. U.S. control of the world actually peaked in 1945. It's been declining ever since. There's a lot of talk about America's decline, but it's quite misleading. The peak was 1945. The U.S. had power that had absolutely no counterpart in all of history. The U.S. probably had close to half the world's wealth. It had incredible security, controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans, just about everything. But it started to collapse pretty quickly. In 1949, China became independent, which is described in an interesting way. Like, I can lose my computer, but I can't lose your computer, right? But the loss of China implies the tacit understanding we own the world. And if something gets out of control, we lost it. And that was not a small thing. It became a huge issue in American life. Who was responsible for the loss of China? Then you get McCarthyism, the repression, the destruction of unions, enormous thing. It goes on and on. Kennedy, when he was trying to decide whether to escalate in Vietnam, he told his advisors, I don't want to be responsible for the loss of Indochina, right up to the present. And that was a serious decline. It changed American policy. And since then, Europe reconstructed, the industrial societies reconstructed. They'd been devastated by the war. Decolonization took place. The world just became more diverse. By about 1970, the U.S. Control of the world economy was down to maybe 25%, which is enormous, but not 50%. And the world was economically what was called tripolar. There was a German-based Europe, a U.S.-based North America, and at that time Japan-based East Asia, which was the most rapidly developing region, now China-based. And it's continued since. I mean, the U.S. by now has maybe 20% of the world economy, and in military terms, there's just nobody nearby. U.S. spends practically as much as the rest of the world combined, technologically way more advanced, and so on. But in economic terms, it's somewhat declines. However, that's very misleading, because these investigations by political scientists, diplomats, and so on, talk about national power. But in the modern world, especially since the 90s, since neoliberal globalization took place, that's not really a measure of control. The real measure of control is which corporations own things. And it turns out, if you do a study, that US-based multinationals own about half the world, which is enormous. Now, they are very closely integrated with the state. The state supports them. They pretty much run the state. And they have about 50, in practically every sector, manufacturing, retail, commerce, finance, US corporations are first. And that's that's combined with national power. So you really have to rethink what power means. It means lots of things in a diverse world. But the U.S., still remains supreme by far.
We all know what that means. Protection of the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. That's big stuff.
First of all, I think one should be cautious about talking about the CIA. The CIA does not act on its own. The CIA is an agency of the executive branch, and there's almost no exception to this. They just do what they're told. One of their jobs is to allow kind of denial, like the executive can say, I didn't know this was happening. So it's you can blame things if something goes wrong or there's some atrocity. You can say the CIA is responsible, and the executive branch, which is giving the orders, has the possibility of denial. So when we talk about the CIA, we're really talking about the executive branch of the government. And yes, they behave differently. So, for example, Latin America during the last 20 years has pretty much thrown them out. The last one, you may remember, was in Ecuador, the Manta, and Rafael Correa, told the United States that they could keep the base if he could put one in Miami, which is an indication of the shift in relations. U.S. power is extensive, undoubtedly, but it's not what it once was. The IMF, basically an agency of the Treasury Department, has been pretty much thrown out of Latin America. So there are prospects. Well, the concept of humanitarian intervention is a very interesting one. Almost every act by any great power aggressive act is justified on humanitarian grounds. So from the point of view of the aggressor, it's a humanitarian intervention, not from the point of view of the victims. And it's probably, if we had records from Attila the Hun, we might find the same thing. Now, what is counted? The one that is counted is the bombing of Serbia in 1999, Kosovo bombing. So take a look at that. It was a kind of an ugly place, you know, not a pleasant place. But we know in detail what was going on there. Guerrilla forces, Albanian forces based in Albania were entering Serbia, carrying out terrorist attacks in order to elicit a harsh Serbian response, which could be used as a justification for NATO, meaning U.S. intervention. And they said the casualties are kind of separate on both sides. They estimated about 2,000. When the invasion was undertaken, Wesley Clark, the general in charge, he informed Washington that the result of the U.S. attack would be to sharply escalate atrocities, because Serbia was not going to be able to respond by bombing the United States, so they'd respond on the ground. As the invasion began, he informed the press, which wouldn't report it, that the predictable, his word, effect of the bombing would be to sharply escalate Serbian atrocities, which is what happened. U.S. started bombing Serbia. Serbia started driving out Albanians from Kosovo, carrying out atrocities, huge reporting and denunciation of Serbian atrocities. Milosevic was brought to the criminal court with an indictment for his massive crimes. All, with one minor exception, were after the bombing. If you look back at the discussion, the way it's framed is it was a humanitarian intervention because we had to stop Serbian atrocities. And that's the way it's presented in the West. You have to keep quiet about the fact that the Serbian atrocities were the consequence, the predicted and expected consequence of the invasion. And whenever that's, so for example, there's a major report by distinguished international lawyers headed by Judge Goldstone, a distinguished South African lawyer, which studied the invasion, and it concluded, its phrase was illegal but legitimate. Illegal because in obvious violation of international law, but legitimate because you had to stop these horrible atrocities, which followed the invasion. So they simply inverted the chronology, which is what is usually done. Occasionally, it's recognized that, yeah, it was afterwards, but they said it doesn't matter because you had to stop it before they happened. So we invaded in order to prevent atrocities which were caused by the invasion. So that's the major humanitarian intervention. And shortly after the invasion, the issue of humanitarian intervention was placed on the international agenda because there had been this marvelous example of it. And there are two different conclusions drawn. One was by the United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly had a strong resolution about what's called responsibility to protect. It basically reiterates international law. It says explicitly that no military act can be taken unless authorized by the Security Council. Anything else is illegal and unacceptable. And it goes on to urge that pressures be used to ensure that governments don't repress their own populations. So use whatever diplomatic and other pressures you can do. That's the formal responsibility to protect. There's another one. A commission was set up headed by Gareth Evans, the former Australian Prime Minister, the Evans Commission. And that it gives a long discussion of responsibility to protect. It's about the same as the UN version, with one difference. It has a paragraph saying, in case the Security Council doesn't agree to authorize intervention, regional groupings can intervene on their own by force, subject to subsequent approval by the Security Council. Well, which regional grouping is capable of intervening? There's one, it's called NATO. So what this was saying is even though the Security Council doesn't authorize it, NATO is justified in intervening. And when you look at the discussion of this, always they say intervention, responsibility to protect is legal because the UN Assembly authorized it, but then the version that's adopted is the Evans version. And it's a beautiful example of the way propaganda operates in a well-functioning, powerful system. You take a look at the scholarly literature, media coverage, everything else. So the bombing of Libya was humanitarian intervention. Actually, there was all kind of stories about Gaddafi's doing this and that. He's not a nice guy doing ugly things, but that had nothing to do with it. There was a resolution, UN resolution, which called for establishing a no-fly zone and moving towards diplomatic moves to settle the problem. Gaddafi accepted it. The resolution was initiated by Britain, France, and the United States, who instantly violated, becoming the air force of the opposition, and went on to a big bombing attack. Finally, it ended up murdering Gaddafi, ended up killing probably 10,000 or more people, much more than anything that had happened before. It left Libya a total wreck as it is today, with in the hands of warring militias. There was a huge flow of jihadis and arms into the Levant, West Asia, but also mainly into West Africa, which has now become the major source of radical terrorism in the world, largely a consequence of the so-called humanitarian intervention in Libya. And you look at case after case, and that's what they're like. Occasionally you can find an example that maybe you could argue is humanitarian intervention, but those are not permitted because the U.S. bitterly opposed them, fought against them, and it's the wrong people anyway, even the wrong color. So that's humanitarian intervention. Well, in the case of Afghanistan, Afghanistan and Iraq are different. In the case of Afghanistan, I suspect it was just revenge. It's just probably pretty much like what Abdul Haq said. They want to show their muscle. Somebody attacked us, we're going to show the world that we can attack somebody even more harshly. And so it's like when Trump says to Korea, I've got a bigger button than you do, that kind of thing. So we'll show it to you. And because there was really no strategic or other purpose behind it. Iraq was quite different. Iraq is the country they wanted to invade because it has huge resources right in the midst of the major oil-producing region in the world. There's a major strategic goal is to gain control of Iraq, be able to exploit its oil, set up military bases there, which was, in fact, by the end of the Bush years, 2007, it was conceded publicly to have been the primary goal. But so that you can understand on some traditional imperial grounds, but I suspect Afghanistan really was pretty much what Abdul Haq said.